The room is cool enough that the paper feels dry at your fingertips, and somewhere nearby a fluorescent light gives off its steady, low hum. On the desk, the Beslane file rests open to its earliest report, a date stamped in fading ink, a place name, and a small inconsistency no one could quite smooth away. At first, it looked like the sort of case that would settle with one more interview, one more careful walk through familiar streets. But cases like this often begin to lengthen quietly through clerk's notes, returned letters, and witness statements copied again by hand years later. You can almost picture the first detectives marking times in the margins, trying to keep the sequence orderly while one detail kept drifting out of place. Nothing about the work was dramatic, at least not on the surface. It was patient work, made of doors knocked on twice, evidence wrapped and shelved, and names that waited a long time to be spoken again. And as the file grew older, that one unresolved point began to matter more than anyone first expected. So, tonight, we can sit with the Beslane case the way cold case investigators often do, by starting with the paper trail and following it slowly into the years that gathered around it. The first page that truly catches your eye is not the initial report itself, but a correction slip pinned behind it. Someone, probably a records clerk with careful hands, had retyped a single line after the original carbon copy became too faint to trust. The line concerned an arrival time, not the time of a train or a bus, though for years people assumed it might be. It was the reported time that a witness, a woman named Celia Van, said she had seen Armand Beslane near the corner of Lark Street and Belfoundry Road. On one page, that sighting was written as a little after 7 in the evening. On the retyped slip, made only 3 days later, the same sighting became a little after 8. That single hour did something quiet but lasting. It unsettled every other note around it. Because if Celia Van had seen Beslane at 7, then the rest of the evening could still be arranged into a familiar shape. If she had seen him at 8, then one earlier statement, already considered reliable, could not also be true. So the first detectives did what careful investigators usually do when a file begins to lean. They went back out. They knocked again on the same doors. They asked the same neighbors to remember the same evening, only more slowly this time, with clocks, street lamps, and weather brought into the conversation. The place itself was modest enough that people thought memory would hold. Beslane had lived and worked within a narrow stretch of town where errands were local and routines had edges. His name appeared in municipal records as a bookkeeper for a small agricultural supplier near the river warehouses. He was known, but not famous. Steady, said one note. Private, said another. Punctual, said a third, and that word was underlined once in pencil, then never mentioned again. The first practical decision in the file came on the 4th day. Detective Emile Corot, who signed his memos in a hand so angled it looked almost printed, decided that every statement would be logged twice, once in summary, once in full. That choice matters to you now because the summaries tried to make people sound consistent, while the full statements preserved all the hesitation. And in this case, hesitation became its own kind of evidence. Celia Van, in the full version of her interview, did not simply say she saw Beslane at a little after 8. She said she believed it was after 8 because she had already cleared supper plates and because a radio program she listened to on Thursdays had ended. But the officer who first spoke with her had written 7. No explanation, no margin note. Just 7. That meant one of two things had happened. Either Celia's memory shifted almost at once, or the first note was rushed and wrong. Neither possibility was dramatic. Both were troublesome. Because the file was beginning to show what long investigations often show very early, a case is not made of facts alone. It's made of how facts were written down, by whom, and under what kind of pressure. As the detectives widened their first round of interviews, another small obstacle appeared. Beslane had mailed 2 letters in the week before he vanished from ordinary routine, and only one had reached its recipient. The delivered letter went to his older sister, Mireille. who lived 2 towns away and kept it folded inside the same envelope for years. The missing letter was stranger because it existed only as an entry in the post office ledger. A clerk remembered weighing it. The address line was said to be local, but no recipient ever came forward and no returned envelope was found. So the investigators made a second decision. They collected handwriting samples, not from suspects at first, but from Beslane himself. They wanted to know whether the address in the ledger could be matched to his ordinary writing habits if the envelope ever turned up. A practical step, a modest one. Still, it altered the shape of the inquiry, because once you begin preserving writing, paper fibers, envelopes and carbon copies, you admit, quietly, that the case may outlive the week in which it began. That was the moment the shelf started waiting for it. Family members, meanwhile, moved through the case in a different rhythm. They were not reading reports. They were protecting details. Marie Beslane repeated, in 2 interviews and then a third years later, that her brother disliked changing plans after dusk. A cousin said he carried receipts in his coat pocket until they became soft at the edges. A former co-worker said he wrote down appointments twice, once in a pocket diary and once on a desk calendar at the office. No single habit solved anything. But habits matter in an old file. They tell you what would have been ordinary and what would have been just strange enough to notice. That is how the central anomaly sharpened. If Armand Beslane truly appeared on Lark Street after 8, as the later statement claimed, then he was not where another witness placed him less than 20 minutes earlier. That other witness, Thomas Hale, was a delivery driver who signed for a shipment at the supplier's office and insisted Beslane had spoken with him there at 7:45. Thomas was specific because he had written the time beside his delivery notation. The notation still sat in the file, copied, recopied, and finally preserved in a plastic sleeve many years later. The handwriting was his. The ink was of the period. The paper matched the supplier's standard receipt stock. On its own, it looked ordinary. Set beside Celia Van's revised statement, it became the hinge of the early investigation. 1 hour changed to another. One witness stood by her memory. Another stood by his receipt. And because neither account could be discarded lightly, the detectives had to test the streets themselves. They measured the distance between the supplier's office and Lark Street by car, then on foot. They walked it in daylight first, then after dark. They noted the pavement, the narrow corner where carts once turned, the crossing near the foundry wall where people often paused to speak. The reports from those walks are some of the calmest pages in the file. No theories, no drama, only distances and times. A little under 12 minutes at a brisk walk, 7 by car in light traffic, longer if you stopped, longer if you were noticed, longer if you never intended to go straight there at all. That was the first real escalation. Small, methodical, impossible to ignore. The original assumption had been simple. A local man seen by familiar people following a familiar routine and slipping somehow into uncertainty. But once the walking times were logged, the old easy shape no longer held. Either Thomas Hale's delivery notation was wrong, or Celia Van's corrected time was wrong, or Beslane moved through that evening in a way no one had first imagined. So Detective Corot chose a third action. He requested records beyond the neighborhood. Not many, just enough to test whether Beslane's last known movements touched places outside the first search radius. Bus depots, a service station on the northern road, a boarding house registry near the river crossing. This decision seems modest when you read it now. In the moment, it marked a change in tone. The case was no longer being handled as one more short local disruption. It was beginning to widen, and widening brought the first setback. The boarding house registry for that month had water damage. The service station kept receipts only by amount, not by name. The bus depot had changed staff, and the man who might have remembered an unusual late ticket had left for seasonal work. Nothing failed dramatically. Things simply thinned out. That is what older investigations often feel like. Not a door slamming shut, but paper losing color, ink fading, addresses going stale. Still, one useful thread remained. Among the early pages is a note from a junior clerk in the Municipal Records Office, a woman named Edith Sorel, whose role in the case was mostly administrative until it suddenly was not. Edith noticed that one address written in Beslane's contact notes had been copied inconsistently across forms. Sometimes it appeared as Westmorrow Lane, sometimes as Westmoreland Lane. The difference was 2 letters. The consequence was an entire missed search, because Westmorrow existed inside town limits, while Westmoreland was an older road name used in the county books, beyond the district line. That discovery did not solve the inconsistency at the center of the file, but it did produce a new practical choice. Corot and another detective, Jules Anquet, had to decide whether to spend a day following a possible clerical error into county records that might lead nowhere. They went. That choice matters because patient investigations are built on these ordinary risks. A day spent on the wrong road is still a day not spent somewhere else. The county archive held property ledgers, voter rolls, and outdated route maps. And there, under the older spelling, they found a rented cottage once linked to a man named Luc Delatour, whose name appeared nowhere in the initial neighborhood interviews. Delatour was not treated as a suspect at first. He was simply connected to an address Beslane had written down. But once his name entered the file, the early theory shifted. Beslane's final known week might not have been confined to his home, his office, and the local corner where Celia Van thought she saw him. It might also have included a road outside town, a rented cottage, and a person no one had thought to ask about. So investigators looked for Delatour. By then, he had already moved. The cottage owner said he stayed only briefly. A labor record suggested he had worked seasonally near the quarry. A forwarding address led to a boarding room that had since changed tenants twice. Again, nothing dramatic, just the long, familiar labor of trying not to let a name vanish faster than the file could keep up. At the same time, family pressure changed in a quieter way. Mireille stopped asking when the case would be resolved and began asking whether the papers were being kept together. It is a striking change when you read her letters in sequence. At first, she wanted answers. Then she wanted continuity. She wanted to know whether notes were lost when staff changed, whether receipts stayed attached to statements, whether names remained spelled the same way from year to year. Families in long cases often become guardians of order before they become guardians of hope. They understand, sometimes before the detectives do, that the future may depend on whether some very small page survives. And the pages did survive, mostly because the file never fully closed. It thinned, it stalled. But it did not settle. No charge was brought, no clean explanation was written. Instead, the record shows a slow transition from active inquiry to maintained uncertainty. Witness statements were indexed. Letters were preserved. One envelope with no surviving contents was kept because the postal mark might matter later. A set of office keys, thought to be ordinary at first, was logged separately after a note suggested one key did not match the supplier's known locks. That, too, became an inconsistency. A small one. But the Beslane file was becoming a place where small things refused to smooth out. You can feel the mood changing in the reports from that first year. Less confidence in summaries, more qualifiers. Words like believed, likely, possibly. And then one phrase that appears 3 times in 3 different hands. Timeline not fixed. Once those words are in a file, the case changes. Because now every object has to be revisited not just for what it is, but for where it belongs in time. The receipt from Thomas Hale, the corrected hour from Celia Van, the ledger entry for the missing letter, the old road name, the rented cottage, the extra key, none of them solved the central question. Together they made the original explanation look thinner than before. So the case took on the shape many cold investigations do. Not closed, not active in a daily sense, but waiting in organized layers for someone later to read it with fresh patience. And that is what happened, though not all at once. The papers sat first in a district cabinet, then in municipal storage. after an office renovation shifted older records downstairs. A clerk tied several bundles with cotton tape. Another wrote Beslane across a fresh file spine after the original tab cracked and fell away. Years passed in the quiet way records mark time, through stamps, transfers, initials, and inventories. Yet the inconsistency remained where it had always been, 1 hour against another, one route against another, one local story resisting a local ending. And because that resistance stayed on the page, the investigation could not remain as small as it had started. The longer the papers sat, the more one inconsistency began to matter, and the investigation had to widen beyond its first assumptions. By the time the file was taken down again for renewed comparison, the town itself had changed in ordinary ways that complicate memory. Street names had been standardized. A grocer mentioned in the early interviews had closed. Bell Foundry Road no longer carried the same traffic, and younger officers reading the reports needed older maps just to understand the witnesses' routes. That is often how a case grows larger. Not through a single revelation, but because time makes even familiar ground harder to read. The detective assigned to the review was not one of the originals. His name was Martin Vale, and his first memo has the respectful tone of someone entering a room where other people have already done their best work. He did not write that the case had been mishandled. He wrote that certain relationships between statements had not been fully exhausted. That phrase, fully exhausted, opened the next stage. It meant comparing accounts not only within the first week, but across months, addresses, and institutions. Vale began with the witness list. Then he marked everyone who had moved. Then everyone whose statement mentioned a location outside the initial search boundary. By the end of that process, the Beslane case no longer looked strictly local. It looked like a map with faint lines leading outward, each one easy to dismiss alone, harder to dismiss together. One of those lines came from a report that had been overlooked because it seemed too slight to matter. A railway porter, interviewed only once, had remembered a man asking for the next service north on the same evening the timeline began to fray. He could not identify Beslane with certainty. He did not claim he could. What he remembered was a habit. The man kept checking a folded paper before speaking, as if confirming an address rather than a destination. That detail might have rested quietly in the file forever, except that Beslane's sister had described the same habit years earlier. He wrote things down twice. He checked them. He did not trust memory when paper could do the work. So Vale made another careful decision. He reopened the minor witness accounts, the ones too uncertain for the original theory, but too specific to discard. And once he did, the case widened again. The porter had given his statement years earlier, on a form so brief it left almost no room for uncertainty. Yet uncertainty was exactly what it contained. He did not say, "This was Armand Beslane." He said, "This man reminded me of someone who preferred paper to memory." That was enough for Martin Vale to begin comparing habits instead of only names. He laid the witness accounts side by side, not by date first, but by small repeated actions. Who mentioned folded notes? Who mentioned checked addresses? Who mentioned a pause before travel, as if the traveler were not deciding where to go, but whether to go at all? That method seems quiet. It is quiet. But it can reorder an old case more gently and sometimes more effectively than any dramatic new clue. A timeline built from actions often survives where a timeline built from assumptions begins to fray. Vale found that several people, none of them certain enough to shape the original inquiry, described the same sort of hesitation. A tobacconist near the station remembered a man buying matches, then stepping away from the counter to reread something in his hand. A woman at a public call office recalled someone asking whether county lines changed the cost of a call. A garage attendant on the North Road thought a customer had asked for directions, then corrected himself before the attendant finished explaining. Each report was small. Each report had once looked too slight to matter. Together they suggested movement outward from town, not in one clean line, but in a pattern of checking, pausing, and adjusting. That mattered because the early theory had treated the evening as settled until it was interrupted. Now the evening began to look unsettled from the start. You can feel the shift in Vale's notes. He stops writing as if he is confirming a finished route. He starts writing as if he is tracing an intention that changed shape more than once. That is a harder thing to investigate. It asks more of paper, it asks more of patience, and it often requires investigators to revisit people who were only briefly touched by the case the first time. So he began requesting second interviews. Not with everyone, only with those whose first statements contained a specific quality, not certainty, structure. A person who remembered a sequence, even if they doubted the name attached to it, might still help. An old case can survive on sequence long after identification weakens. One of those second interviews brought him back to Thomas Hall, the delivery driver with the signed receipt. By then, Hale had retired from driving and was living farther west, in a smaller house, with a shed full of labeled tools. Val's memorandum about that meeting is striking for its restraint. He did not write that Hale contradicted himself. He wrote that Hale's confidence rested more on his receipt than on his memory of the face. That is not a small distinction. For years, the receipt had been treated as both a time marker and a confirmation of presence. Now Vale began to separate those two functions. The paper might still prove a delivery at 7:45. It might not prove that Beslane personally accepted it. Hale explained that evening as carefully as he could. He remembered the office. He remembered the weather being damp enough to leave marks on the crate wrapping. He remembered waiting at the desk while a man signed. He had always believed that man was Beslane, because Beslane usually handled that sort of paperwork. But when Val asked him very gently whether he would swear after all those years that he had looked directly and carefully enough to distinguish Beslane from another office worker in the dimness of a late hour, Hale paused. Then he said he would not swear to that. The receipt remained important, but the certainty attached to it softened. And once it softened, Celia Van's corrected hour no longer had to defeat it. Both accounts could stand if the person at the office was not Beslane himself. That possibility had been available from the beginning, of course. Many possibilities are. What changes an investigation is when someone finally gives one enough disciplined attention to test it. Vale did not celebrate the adjustment. He treated it as a narrowing. One contradiction had become less absolute, but the case had not become easier. Because if Beslane was not certainly at the supplier's office at 7:45, then his movements between dusk and the later sightings were not merely uncertain, they were open. And open time in a file like this can fill very quickly. The second important re-interview was with Celia Van. She was older then, and she no longer lived near Lark Street. Still, she remembered the correction slip, and that told Vale something before she even answered his questions. It told him the case had remained present to her. People often remember not only an event, but the moment they realized their memory had become evidence. Celia said she had never meant to create confusion. She had been trying in those early days to be useful. The first officer came in the afternoon, she said, while she was distracted. The second interview came after she had talked with her husband about the supper dishes, the radio schedule, and the order of the evening. That to her was why she changed the time, not because she saw more clearly later, but because she reconstructed more carefully. Vale asked whether she was certain the man she saw was Beslane. She answered in a way that many careful witnesses do. She was certain enough that she had said so then. She was not so certain that she would refuse the possibility of error now. Again, the file did not sharpen into certainty. It became more honest. That may sound like a smaller achievement. In practice, it is often the more useful one. An honest uncertainty can be worked with. A false certainty can hold a case still for decades. From there, the wider comparison continued. Vale traced old addresses through tax rolls and rental ledgers. He asked the county to retrieve duplicate property cards for Westmoreland Lane. He requested employment records from the quarry office tied to Luc Delatour, the briefly rented cottage, and the months surrounding Beslane's disappearance from ordinary routine. What he found was not a dramatic hidden life. It was something quieter. Delatour's records were incomplete in exactly the way seasonal labor records often are. Weeks listed without exact dates, pay notations without full names on every sheet, a forwarding contact that led first to a labor agent, then to a shipping clerk, then nowhere solid at all. But one surviving entry did matter. It placed Delatour off quarry work during the same week he was believed to be renting the county cottage. That meant he was not merely associated with the address. He had time to be there. And if Beslane had written down that road under the older county name, then the old road was not just a copying error, it was a real destination in his notes. That was enough for Vale to widen the map again. He marked everyone in the file connected to the county line: the porter, the garage attendant, Delatour, a telephone inquiry about rates beyond town, a petrol purchase on the North Road, paid in cash, too ordinary on its own to stand up as evidence, but close enough in time to remain on the board. Then he added something new. He began comparing those movements to records outside the police file entirely: a library register, a parish visitor's book, a maintenance log from the River Bridge office. It sounds excessive, perhaps, until you remember what he was trying to solve. Not a public mystery announced by one loud event, a quiet dislocation in routine. When a person disappears from their ordinary pattern without leaving a clear scene to explain it, almost any surviving institution can hold part of the answer. The bridge office log gave him almost nothing. One line about delayed maintenance due to poor weather. One note about a gate lock inspected and found secure. No names, no lead. The parish book was similarly spare. Visitors from nearby villages. A christening entry. A memorial fund notation. Nothing connected. The library register, though, produced something more delicate. Beslane's name did not appear in the lending ledger that week. That would not have mattered if not for what his sister had said long before. He wrote things down twice. He followed habits. And among those habits was a regular Thursday library visit near closing, when practical manuals and municipal almanacs could still be borrowed without much fuss. That week, there was no entry. Not once. Absence is never strong evidence by itself. Still, in a case built on routines, the break in routine had meaning. It suggested that whatever redirected Beslane's evening may have begun earlier than the window between 7 and 8. Val wrote in one margin, "Deviation may predate last witnessed hour." It is a plain sentence, but it moved the inquiry backward. Instead of asking only where Beslane went after the conflict in times arose, investigators had to ask what had already shifted in the day before either witness account was recorded. That change led them to the office. Not the delivery receipt this time, but the quieter parts of office life. Desk calendars, incoming mail, appointment slips, a cash drawer reconciliation sheet. The supplier had changed ownership by then, and much had been discarded. Yet not everything. An old storeroom had preserved a few cartons of accounting records that no one thought worth sorting because they belonged to a defunct filing system. In them, Vale found fragments rather than answers. A page torn from a staff rota, an invoice book with carbon impressions still visible under slant light, a maintenance request about a sticking back door, and a desk calendar page detached, with one notation in Beslane's hand. County caller, after supper, no name, no address. Only that, the words were not dramatic, but they were specific enough to matter. The phrase "after supper" aligned, at least broadly, with Celia Van's recollection of the evening period. The phrase "county caller" aligned with Westmoreland Lane, with Delatour, with the widened geography of the case. And because the note was in Beslane's hand, investigators no longer had to infer every outward movement from witnesses alone. There was at least one surviving indication that he expected some connection beyond town that evening. Now the earlier details began to gather around a shape, not a solution, a shape. Beslane may have arranged to meet someone linked to the county road. He may have expected that meeting after supper. He may have left his normal pattern earlier in the day, skipping the library and moving with unusual caution. A man at the station checked a folded paper. A woman at a call office remembered a question about county line charges. A garage attendant recalled someone asking for directions, then stopping himself. One by one, the details looked less like scattered uncertainty and more like parts of an incomplete route. Still, old cases resist elegance. For every line that begins to connect, another fades. When Vale tried to identify who else in the supplier's orbit might have signed for Hale's 7:45 delivery, he ran into a familiar problem. The staff list for that quarter was incomplete. One clerk had died. Another had moved overseas. A porter mentioned in payroll summaries could not be matched cleanly to any surviving address. The office, which once seemed orderly enough to support Beslane's reputation for punctuality, had become just another place where paper thinned before certainty arrived, so the investigation leaned on tone again. Vale reread the statements of Beslane's co-workers. He was looking for any mention of visitors, county clients, unusual appointments, or habits disrupted that week. Most gave him little. A complaint about delayed invoices. A note that Beslane had seemed distracted once that month. An argument over stock figures that had nothing to do with the case. But one statement, from a junior office assistant named Nella Orse, began to matter more than it had before. In her original interview, Nella had said that Beslane had asked for the spare correspondence ledger on the day before his routine broke. At the time, no one found that remarkable. A bookkeeper asking for a ledger is hardly a clue. Years later, Vale noticed what came after that sentence. Nella had also said the ledger was usually used only when someone wanted to keep a letter off the main office sequence until it could be copied neatly. That is the kind of sentence that can sleep in a file for years, not because it is unimportant, because its importance depends on another fact arriving later. Now that investigators knew about the missing letter logged at the post office but never found, the spare ledger mattered. If Beslane wrote a local letter and wanted it handled outside the ordinary office correspondence stream, then perhaps he was trying to preserve privacy or avoid gossip or simply keep a practical matter from becoming office talk. Any of those possibilities would fit a private man, and any of them would make the missing letter more central than it first seemed. Vale could not find the spare correspondence ledger itself. It had almost certainly been discarded, but he could trace its use indirectly. Office supply requests showed replacement blotting sheets. A desk inventory listed extra carbon paper issued that week. Most useful of all, a waste paper contractor's invoice suggested that old office books had been removed in batches only months later, not immediately. That meant the ledger had existed after the event. It might have been seen by someone else. So he asked. He found Nella Orse, then living with a married daughter in a town by the estuary, and asked whether she remembered any unusual letter copying during that period. She did not remember a full text. She remembered paper color. That was all. Cream, not white, and heavier than the office stock. That detail aligned with the letter to Mirelle, which she had preserved. Beslane had used the same cream stationery there. Again, it was not proof, but it supported a pattern. Beslane may have written at least 2 letters that week on his own paper. One reached family, one vanished into the local post. If the missing local letter concerned the county caller noted on the desk calendar, then the Beslane file had, at its center, not one unexplained movement, but a small chain of private arrangements. At this stage, the investigation stopped being only about a lost sighting. It became about communication. Who wrote to whom? Who expected a meeting? Who used old road names instead of standardized ones? Who had reason to stay off the main office books? That kind of case grows larger not in miles alone, but in records. It forces detectives to compare postal habits, stationery, routing slips, and the order in which clerks copied notes. It also forces them to admit how much depends on preservation. If Miraelle had not kept her brother's letter folded in its envelope, if Nella had not remembered paper color, if the post office ledger line had not survived, then the communication thread might never have been visible at all. Vale understood that. His next memo requested a systematic review of all archived material physically associated with the case, not just witness statements, photographs, envelope fragments, Desk contents, property logs, even the office keys that had once seemed ordinary. He wrote that the case had reached the point where object relationships might prove more durable than memory relationships. That was the bridge into the next phase. Once investigators stop asking only what people said and start asking what the objects can still tell, the pace changes. Slower in one way, more exacting in another. Boxes are opened. Labels are checked against older labels. A photograph taken for one purpose is studied for another, and what looks settled on paper can become uncertain all over again when the physical record is laid out under better light. The evidence room inventory showed that the Beslane materials had not remained in one place. They had moved from district storage to municipal archive, then briefly to a basement room during renovations, then back to central records. Each move introduced risk, mislabeling, loss, quiet substitution of one copy for another. Vale knew that before he ever opened the first carton, so he brought in someone whose work was not detection exactly, but preservation. Her name was Agnes Fell, an archivist attached to municipal records, known for noticing when files did not match their own indexes. She approached the Beslane materials with a kind of patience detectives often admire, not because she was chasing a theory, but because she distrusted disorder. The cartons contained what you would expect from an old, unresolved inquiry: statement folders, copied receipts, a ring of keys in a paper packet, several photographs of streets and office interiors, an envelope stored without contents because of its postmark, loose maps folded too often, a property card for the county cottage, and, in a smaller box nested inside one of the larger cartons, a group of items marked to be retained for possible later laboratory comparison. That phrase had been written years earlier. Possible later. It is one of the quietest promises a file can make. It means the people working then knew their tools had limits. It means they hoped, without saying so directly, that another generation might see further. Agnes began not with the most famous items in the file, but with the labels themselves. She checked accession numbers against transfer lists. She compared old storage references to newer index cards. And in doing so, she noticed that one photograph packet was logged under two slightly different descriptions. In one list, it was noted as street corner views, Lark and Bell. In another, it was office exterior and rear lane. That discrepancy could have meant nothing. A shorthand variation, an indexing shortcut. Still, Agnes requested the packet. Inside were 6 photographs, each mounted on thin backing card. 4 showed the corner near Lark Street, just as expected. 1 showed the supplier's front entrance. The last showed the rear lane behind the office, where a service door opened toward the alley. What made Agnes pause was not the lane itself. It was the chalkboard visible through the glass pane of the rear door. The writing was faint, nearly incidental. But under magnification, one line appeared to read, "Caller at 8, County." Not exactly the same as the desk calendar note. Close enough to matter. And crucially, visible in a photograph no one had treated as textual evidence. When Vale saw that, the desk calendar phrase stopped standing alone. Now there were 2 independent traces from the office environment suggesting an expected county contact around 8. That did not identify the caller. It did not prove Beslane reached the meeting, but it strengthened the conclusion that the evening was arranged, not accidental. The rear lane photograph also raised a practical question. Why had so much of the early focus remained on front routes and public sightings if the office itself had a rear exit suitable for a quieter departure? The answer was simple and very human, because the front was where witnesses naturally looked. The rear was service space, less social, less observed. In many cases, what is overlooked first is not hidden. It is merely ordinary to the people who use it every day. So investigators revisited the building plans. The supplier's old layout was reconstructed from permit filings and a fire insurance map. The rear service door led to a narrow lane, then to a side street that joined the northern road without passing Lark Street at all. That mattered a great deal. If Beslane had expected a county caller around 8, He might have left by the rear lane to avoid delaying office business, or to avoid being seen, or simply because that was practical. In that scenario, Celia Van's sighting at Lark Street might still be real, but it would no longer have to anchor the entire route. She could have seen him later, earlier, or not at all. The map had widened into branching possibilities. At the same time, the physical items themselves were beginning to invite new scrutiny. The key packet, for example, had long been described as office keys, with one note years back suggesting that one key did not fit the supplier's current locks. Agnes laid the ring beside old locksmith worksheets preserved in municipal permit files. Those worksheets listed key weight changes made after a burglary scare years after the case began. As a result, the mismatch once seen by investigators might have been misleading. A key not fitting the later locks did not mean it was never connected to the office. So the key mystery, which had seemed promising for a time, softened into context. That happens often when old evidence meets better record keeping. Some puzzles shrink. Others grow larger because new records make them more precise instead of more certain. That was what happened with the envelope that had been saved for its postmark. Agnes placed it under a cooler lamp, then compared it with the preserved letter to Mireille. The paper stock was close. Not identical in age, perhaps, but close enough in weight and finish to suggest the same personal supply. The postmark was local, just as the ledger entry had implied. But the thing that caught her attention was not the stamp, it was the seal line. The flap had not been moistened evenly. One edge held firm. The other had lifted and been pressed down again. That suggested haste, or second thoughts, or simply distracted hands. None of those possibilities were dramatic. Still, they belonged to the emerging portrait of that week. A man writing privately. A man checking paper more than once. A man expecting some county contact after supper. Val asked for a more careful review of all retained paper items. Not to promise a solution through science alone, but because paper preserves habits. Fold depth, pressure marks, the order of writing, the kind of stationery a person reaches for when they do not want office stock. This was the point where the case began to draw in people beyond the original investigative circle. A document examiner from the regional laboratory was asked to assess the surviving handwriting samples. A conservator reviewed ink stability before any impressions were tested, and a cold case supervisor, reading the accumulated requests, wrote a short approval note that changed the file's status in practice even before it changed on paper. Proceed with limited modern review. Those 4 words are plain. They do not sound like much, but in a quiet case, they mean movement. The retained desk calendar page was photographed again, this time under oblique light. The purpose was not only to read the visible notation, it was to see whether earlier or later pages had left pressure traces behind. That kind of work is slow. The page is angled, the light is adjusted, the eye learns patience, and then, sometimes, a second line appears where no one had expected it. On the Beslane page, faint enough that 2 reviewers hesitated before agreeing, there seemed to be a partial impression above the visible note, not a full sentence, only fragments. Meet, Morin, bring. The examiner would not overstate it. Valet would not let anyone overstate it. Pressure traces can mislead. Expectation can fill in what the eye wants to see, so they recorded the finding conservatively. Possible indented writing consistent with county reference. Even in that cautious form it mattered. For years, West Morin Lane had hovered at the edge of the inquiry as a copied road name, a county address, and a possible destination. Now the name seemed to appear again in relation to an expected meeting. That was enough to justify the next decision. The Beslane case would not remain an occasional review handled between newer matters. It would be advanced for formal reopening. Before that could happen, the file had to be made coherent for people who had not lived with it. This is one of the least visible parts of cold case work, and one of the most important. Someone has to rebuild the chronology. Someone has to say which facts are direct, which are inferred, and which were once accepted too quickly. Martin Vale began that work with unusual care. He separated the file into bands of reliability: documented routine, direct witness statement, corrected statement, recovered physical item, contextual record, speculative association. By doing that, he did not make the case smaller. He made it legible. A case that drifts for years often accumulates confidence in the wrong places. A reopening only helps if old confidence is sorted from old paper. His revised timeline did something simple and powerful. It placed Beslane's final known day inside a broader pattern of small change. No library entry that Thursday, request for the spare correspondence ledger the day before. At least 2 letters on cream personal stationery in the same week. A note in his hand referring to a county caller after supper. A photograph indicating similar wording in the rear office area. A witness at the station recalling a folded paper. A county road written under its older name. A seasonal laborer, Luc Delatour, linked to that road and unaccounted for in the relevant period. And, resting behind all of it, the fact that the original contradiction between 7:45 and after 8 was no longer a fixed contradiction at all. That mattered to the supervisors who reviewed the request. An old case can remain closed if its foundation is merely uncertain. It becomes harder to leave closed when uncertainty has been replaced by a structured alternative. The structured alternative in Beslane was this. He may have arranged a private meeting connected to Westmoreland Lane, and the original inquiry had not fully recognized that because it over-attached one delivery receipt to one identity. That did not solve the case. But it proved the early theory was incomplete. The formal paper moved slowly, as such papers do. A district commander requested a summary. The regional unit asked whether surviving evidence met chain of custody standards for further testing. A legal advisor wanted to know whether any likely suspects remained alive, and whether reopening might support compulsory retrieval of old records. Through all of that, the file sat on a long table with fresh tabs along the side. People who had never heard of Armand Beslane before were now reading his habits, his notes, his mail, his routes. That is one of the strange tendernesses of old investigations. A life becomes present again through clerical order. The case was officially reclassified in the late autumn of that year. Not solved, not charged, reclassified for active cold case inquiry. That phrase reached the family first by letter, then by a phone call. Mireille Beslane was older by then, and her hearing was no longer steady on the telephone. So the follow-up was done in person. Vale went with a family liaison officer and sat in a room where the curtains had been hemmed by hand. He explained that they were not bringing certainty. They were bringing renewed attention. Mireille asked only 2 questions at first. Were the papers still together? And had someone finally read them all in order? There is a quiet gravity in that. Not who did it. Not when will this end. Just whether the years of preservation had finally become useful. Val told her yes. It was the truest answer he could give. Other family members responded differently. A nephew wanted practical details. What did reopened mean? Would there be digging? Would there be names released? A cousin wanted to know whether the county cottage had been searched properly the first time. A niece, who had grown up hearing the case as a family absence rather than a family event, asked whether her mother's old memory of Beslane carrying folded papers had ever mattered. Vale said it had. By then, it really had. At the same time, retired detectives were being called back for recorded conversations. Emile Corot was gone. He had died years earlier. But Jules Anquet was still living, though not in strong health, and his memory moved in careful starts. Vale did not interview him as though he were correcting old mistakes. He interviewed him as one worker inheriting another worker's unfinished task. Anquet remembered the first week as exhausting and ordinary. Too many doors, too many small reports. Too much pressure to say quickly whether there was a local explanation. He said something in that interview that stayed in the later summaries. We kept looking where people looked. That was his way of describing the bias toward the front streets. The public routes, the familiar witnesses, the rear lane, the county road, the private letter, Those belonged to a quieter path, not hidden exactly, just less social, less visible to a town that noticed what passed in front of shop windows. When Vale showed Anquet the rear lane photograph and the possible chalkboard wording, the older detective was silent for a time. Then he nodded and said that the office manager had once mentioned informal notices being left near the back for expected callers who did not use the front counter. That detail had never been written into the early file. No one had asked about it. And here was one of the irreversible things a reopening can do. It can reveal not only missed evidence, but missed questions. Once a missed question becomes visible, you cannot go back to believing the original inquiry had exhausted the scene. The cold case unit took the matter fully in hand after that. A fresh chronology was assigned to two analysts. One rebuilt Beslane's movements from surviving documents. The other rebuilt the office and county network around him. Their work was not glamorous. It was column work. Names on one side, dates across the top, movements, links, occupations, addresses, and notes of uncertainty in between. If you were to look over their shoulders, you would see a matrix more than a story. That is often where patience lives. Not in revelation, but in comparison. One of the earliest gains from that comparison involved Luc Delatour. For years he had remained a thin presence, a rented cottage, incomplete labor records, and no strong tie beyond the road name. Now, through tax duplicates, voter supplements, and an overlooked workers' mutual aid ledger, they placed him more accurately. He had not only rented the cottage, he had received mail care of the quarry office in the previous season, and one of the names listed as a reference on that aid ledger was a surname already in the Beslane file, though buried deep. Orse. Not Nella Orse herself, but her older brother, who had worked transport contracts briefly in the county. The connection was slight. Family names recur. Local work circles overlap. Still, it established something new. The office world and the county cottage world were not separate spheres touching by coincidence. They had at least one social bridge. That changed the tone of the inquiry again. Not outward wandering now, but a network. Val approved a full tracing project. Who knew whom, who handled transport, who had county ties but town employment. Who used old road names because they had lived outside the district longer than others. The analysts drew up a list of 31 names. Most would lead nowhere useful. They knew that. Still, a patient investigation does not resent dead ends. It accepts them as the cost of narrowing truth. Some names fell away quickly. A transport clerk who never overlapped with Beslane's office, a quarry hand who had left the region a year too early, a parish volunteer whose county route had no relation to Westmoreland. Others held a little longer, a postal substitute with cousins near the lane, a supply driver who knew Delatour but denied any link to Beslane, a former office porter whose initials might have matched a partial note until better records showed otherwise. Nothing dramatic, just the soft sorting of possibility. Then came the report that could not be put back. It emerged from a parcel of duplicated municipal correspondence requested for an unrelated property review. In that parcel was a routing slip misfiled decades earlier under a drainage complaint. The slip bore the supplier's office stamp, Beslane's initials in the corner, and a county destination line. More importantly, it was dated one day later than investigators had always believed Beslane's own office involvement ended. For years, the accepted understanding had been that by the evening in question his documented office trail stopped. Now there was proof that a county-addressed communication bearing his initials moved through office handling after that presumed endpoint. There were several possibilities. The slip could have been prepared earlier and stamped later by another clerk. Beslane's initials could have been copied, or he could indeed have remained active in a county correspondence matter later than the old timeline allowed. None of these options were comforting. All of them altered the chronology. This was the kind of reveal a cold case unit recognizes immediately. Not because it solves the mystery, because it destroys a boundary. A boundary once destroyed cannot be restored by habit alone. The original theory had depended on a narrower final day. Now the final day extended, or at least the administrative trace if it did. That forced a sequence of new steps. The unit sought the supplier's surviving stamp records to compare usage. They subpoenaed archived municipal routing books to see whether county correspondence had moved unusually that week. They requested old payroll and porter signatures to test whether others in the office commonly initialed Beslane's work. And they returned to families once more, asking whether any remembered a county matter, a meeting, or a name omitted from old stories because it had seemed too ordinary to matter. This part of the investigation lasted months. Months of requests. Months of waiting for boxes to arrive from regional storage. Months in which nothing seemed to move except paper. But paper does move. And when enough of it settles, shapes appear. The routing slip, compared against known office practice, turned out not to be an ordinary copied form. Its stamp alignment matched direct desk handling rather than clerk batch processing. That did not prove Beslane himself held it. Still, it made a later office connection more likely. Meanwhile, the municipal routing books showed an unusual cluster of county-directed communications that week, tied to land access, deliveries, and one unresolved maintenance question involving a road branch near Westmoreland Lane. Again, no answer. But the county route was no longer abstract. It was active. It was administratively busy. People were traveling between town and county for practical reasons that offered cover, context, and opportunity. The unit decided to pursue the county lead fully. That meant field review. Not hurried searches, but systematic revisiting. The old cottage site was examined through land records and photographs first, then in person. The structure itself was gone by then. A later owner had removed it after years of disuse. Only the plot remained, edged by growth and a low stone boundary. An investigator stood there with old maps and the property card, trying to understand what the place had offered in the relevant years. Privacy, certainly. A road less traveled than town routes. A line of sight to the bend where approaching vehicles could be noticed. And, importantly, access to a secondary track leading toward the North Road without returning directly through the more social part of the district. The place was practical. That was the impression noted in the field report. Not romantic. Not sinister. Practical for a meeting someone preferred not to advertise. Nearby residents, or rather the descendants of those who had once lived nearby, were approached with care. Most had little. A memory of a rented place. A man with dark hair. Visitors once or twice. A lantern seen late in the colder months. One elderly woman interviewed in her daughter's kitchen recalled her father referring to the cottage as the place where town men came when they did not want town questions. That statement had to be treated cautiously. It was hearsay of hearsay, preserved across decades. Still, it fit the broadening understanding. Westmoreland Lane may not have been central because it was remote. It may have been central because it was usefully discreet. By then, the cold case unit had enough to justify a public notice, not a dramatic appeal. A restrained statement asking anyone with memories, papers or photographs related to Armand Beslane, Luc de la Tour, or county contacts tied to the supplier's office to come forward. The notice did something old cases often do when they re-enter public awareness. It shook loose not a flood, but a handful of careful responses. A widow produced a stack of her late husband's notebooks from delivery work. A retired post office assistant remembered cream envelopes being uncommon enough to notice. A former county clerk found route maps with annotations in a drawer he had meant to clear for years. Most responses added context. A few added names. One added a timetable. The widow's notebooks belonged to a transport subcontractor who had occasionally run goods between town and county. On the relevant week, one line noted delay on Moran branch, gate not attended, waited 20 minutes. No names, no cargo specifics. Yet that brief notation supported the idea that someone expected to be met on that road, and that waiting there was part of ordinary practice. The retired post office assistant confirmed that locally purchased cream envelopes came from only one stationer in town. The stationer's old sales books did not survive. Still, the detail narrowed supply. Beslane had likely bought his personal stationery from a place few others used regularly. That made the missing letter feel more his, and the route maps, those mattered in a different way. They showed that the old and new naming conventions around Westmoreland overlapped for longer than earlier researchers assumed. A person moving between town offices and county roads could easily switch terms depending on habit and audience. That may sound minor. In fact, it helped explain the file's long confusion. The road name inconsistency was not necessarily evidence of disguise or deception. It could simply reflect two systems of speech crossing each other. Some uncertainties became more ordinary. That allowed others to stand out more clearly. The case by now had moved irreversibly from remembered mystery to active long-range inquiry. Several early explanations were no longer viable. The 745 office receipt could not carry the weight it once had. The idea of a purely local final route had thinned. The assumption that county references were incidental had collapsed. What remained was harder but cleaner. A likely arranged county meeting, a private communication trail, and a network of modest local ties linking office, road, and rented cottage. With that came a quieter pressure inside the unit. Not urgency, not the kind that makes people run, the steadier kind. If the file had been reopened honestly, then every newly connected detail had to be followed as far as it would go. That meant years of comparison, not one season of effort. Years. The first of those years was spent building what one analyst called the long board, a master comparison of names, dates, vehicle access, road familiarity, postal habits, and institutional contact. Family trees were added where they intersected labor records. Travel permits were added where they touched county work. Clergy notices, boarding house entries, bridge maintenance delays, and local complaints were added when they overlapped with routes of interest. Most of it yielded only texture. But texture is useful. Texture tells you what was possible without making everything suspicious. For example, the board showed that county travel on that Thursday evening was not rare. That mattered because it prevented investigators from overvaluing every North Road mention. At the same time, the board showed that use of the rear lane at the supplier's office after normal hours was uncommon, except when deliveries were expected or private callers had been arranged. That mattered too. Ordinary patterns help old cases resist fantasy. Vale insisted on that. Whenever a line looked elegant too quickly, he asked what ordinary explanation had been ruled out. Whenever a witness memory seemed to fit beautifully, he asked what documentation could carry the same weight. This discipline made the investigation slower. It also made it stronger. One of the more important comparison projects involved family records. Not because the case had become a genealogy puzzle, but because social links persisted where formal records failed. The analysts traced relatives of office staff, quarrymen, postal workers, and transport drivers. Most branches brought nothing. A marriage here, a move there, a son leaving for ship work, a daughter training in a distant hospital. Yet one branch revealed an intersection that had never entered the file. A cousin of Luc Delatour had boarded for a short period with the family of the former office porter whose role in late deliveries had remained unclear. Again, this was not guilt, not even close. It was connection. And in a case built from small overlaps, connection could justify another interview, another record request, another comparison of movement. Some interviews came too late. That is one of the griefs of patient investigation. By the time the unit reached certain names, the people were gone. What remained were children's memories, widows' boxes, and official papers that preserved employment but not character. A woman whose father had once driven the North Road remembered him speaking of town men meeting county men by arrangement rather than by destination. She could not say more. A son of the former porter found a notebook of wage tallies but no identifying comments. Another family produced a biscuit tin of saved paper, and inside it there was almost nothing that spoke directly to the case. There were ration slips from later years, 2 postcards, a church circular, and 1 folded receipt for lamp oil. But tucked between them was a note written in a hand the analysts could not first place, and on the back of it was an address fragment, Morin Branch, Lower Gate. That was enough to justify comparison. The note itself was not from Beslane. It appeared to be a casual reminder, likely passed between workmen. Still, the phrase Lower Gate mattered, because the road maps showed more than one access point near the lane. Until then, West Morin had been treated too broadly, as if one road name described one usable place. In truth, it described bends, gates, side tracks, and a service branch that locals distinguished more carefully than outsiders ever had. So the unit revised its map. Not only a road now, but a cluster, a lower gate, a higher turn, a disused branch, a cottage plot, a maintenance path, a point where waiting would be visible, and another where it would not. That change had a consequence almost at once. The widow's notebook line, delay on Morin Branch, gate not attended, waited 20 minutes, could no longer be read as vague. It began to suggest a specific meeting arrangement at a specific access point, and if a gate was expected to be attended, then someone on one side had expected someone on the other. That is a small shift in language, but a powerful one. A meeting place is one thing. An attended gate implies coordination. It implies someone told someone where to arrive. Once the geography narrowed, the names narrowed with it. The unit removed several people from active comparison because their work routes never touched the lower gate access. Others moved closer to the center. Transport subcontractors who used that branch. Quarrymen who knew the maintenance paths. Office intermediaries who might have directed a caller without appearing in the correspondence themselves. And, still lingering at the edge, Luc Delatour. Delatour's position in the file had always been difficult. Too present to ignore. Too thinly documented to anchor, yet each year of comparison made him feel less accidental. He had the rented cottage. He had the county ties. He had a period of unaccounted time. He had at least one indirect social bridge to office circles through the Ors family network. And now the map suggested that someone moving between town and county discreetly could have used precisely the sort of road environment linked to him. Still, the unit did not force him into the center. They had learned by then not to let one useful figure become a story before the records allowed it. So they worked sideways. They examined not Delatour alone, but everyone who overlapped his practical world. Labor agents, fuel purchases, seasonal rooming houses, mutual aid dues, vehicle access, illness records that might explain gaps in employment. Small things, the kind that rarely appear in public retellings, but often shape what investigators truly know. One such record came from a county infirmary admissions ledger. It did not mention Beslane. It did not mention any crime. It simply showed that a man with Delatour's full name had been treated for a hand injury earlier that autumn, then discharged with no fixed local address beyond the Cottage Road description. That entry seemed ordinary at first. Then one analyst noticed the discharge note included a contact name, not a relative, but a work reference. The surname was Hale, not Thomas Hale, the delivery driver, but a different Hale entirely, Adrian Hale, a wagon repairer whose shop serviced both county carts and town suppliers. That mattered because it created another bridge between the office world and the county lane world. Again, not proof, but structure. Every old case reaches a point where the question changes from, did these people know each other, to how many times can records show they moved inside the same practical network before coincidence becomes an insufficient description. Vale approved a separate network chart just for the Hale connections. It turned out Thomas and Adrian were cousins, not brothers, and their work spheres overlapped only occasionally. Still, occasional overlap was enough. The supplier used repair services. The county routes used the same shop. A private message, passed verbally, could have moved through that kind of place without ever entering formal mail. This possibility revived interest in the missing local letter. For years, investigators had treated the absent letter as a likely key because it represented a private communication. Now they had to consider that the letter might have been only one part of a larger contact chain. A letter sent, a message repeated, a meeting point confirmed by a third person who did not think himself part of anything significant. The unit began interviewing families of tradesmen and intermediaries with a new question in mind. Not whether they remembered Beslane, whether they remembered county instructions being relayed through ordinary business talk. A cart ready by dusk, a gate to be opened, a man expected after supper. Most remembered nothing. Some remembered everything in the broadest way and nothing in the useful way. That is also common. People keep the weather of the past longer than its details. Still, one memory held. Adrian Hale's granddaughter, going through old workshop papers, found a pocket appointment book. It was not dramatic, mostly wheel orders, axle fittings, and names written quickly in pencil. But on the relevant week there was one line that slowed everyone down. Late call, office man, county branch, ask Luke. No surname, no time. No explanation. The investigators read it carefully. Then they read it again. Office man could have meant anyone from a business premises. County branch could have referred to freight rather than a lane. Ask Luke could have been another Luke entirely. No one in the unit pretended the line solved anything, but it answered several old questions at once, enough to be impossible to dismiss. It supported a connection between an office-linked person and a county branch arrangement. It placed Luke, likely Delatour, though still not absolutely provable, inside a relay of practical coordination. And it did so through a routine workshop note, not a later recollection shaped by years of family retelling. That kind of evidence carries a quiet weight. It is modest, it is contemporaneous. It says only what it says, and because of that, it can move a case more than louder things. The consequence was immediate, though measured. Delatour was elevated from contextual figure to principal person of interest in the internal working theory. Not a named suspect publicly. Not enough for that, but enough that every remaining record search would now be built around whether his known movements could be placed more firmly against Beslane's. That meant going beyond the original county archive. The unit requested shipping records from the river landing, because seasonal laborers sometimes moved on barge contracts. They reviewed military reserve paperwork, because men with unstable work histories often left traces there. They searched poor relief notes, debt listings, tenancy disputes, and church assistance rosters. Most produced the same old pattern: fragments, delays, half names, false starts. Then a river landing ledger yielded a small but important correction. Delatour had not left the district as early as one old forwarding entry suggested. A barge hiring book showed him taking 2 days of loading work, nearly a week later than previously believed. That changed the suspect window. For years, one reason Delatour remained hard to press was the possibility that he had simply moved on too quickly. Now he appeared to have remained within practical reach of Westmoreland and town contacts for longer. That did not place him with Beslane. It did remove one easy escape from the map. At the same time, the office network review brought another development. The former office porter's wage notebook had seemed useless at first. Just figures, hours, abbreviations. Then an analyst noticed one repeated mark in the margins on certain late-day entries. A small triangle, not every week. Only on days when evening handling occurred outside the ordinary counterclose. The analyst compared those dates to surviving delivery records, municipal routing slips, and weather logs. A pattern emerged. The triangles tended to appear when rear lane access was used after regular hours. That mattered because one triangle appeared on the day tied to Beslane's disrupted routine. The notebook still gave no names, but it independently supported the proposition that the rear of the office was active that evening in an unusual way. So now the case had several layered supports for the same general idea. A desk note about a county caller after supper, a photograph showing similar wording in the rear office area, a workshop appointment line reading office man, county branch, ask Luke, a porter's notebook mark consistent with after-hours rear lane use. A delivery receipt no longer sufficient to place Beslane at the front office desk at 7:45. and a set of county records slowly drawing de la Tour out of the margins. Cases like this become dangerous in one particular way, not physically, interpretively. When enough details begin pointing in one direction, there is a temptation to imagine the remaining gaps are smaller than they are. Val guarded against that constantly. He ordered a devil's reading of the file. Another analyst, one less invested in the emerging de la Tour theory, was asked to rebuild the case from scratch and test whether the same conclusions still held. This was wise. Sleepy as the work may sound, it is one of the more disciplined acts in a patient investigation. Invite contradiction before the world does. The second analyst, Ruth Sen, worked through the papers with almost severe caution. She accepted very little at first. She noted that office man in the workshop book might not mean Beslane. She noted that Ask Lou could refer to another laborer. She noted that county branch was still a broad phrase without the lower gate note attached directly to it. She also challenged a quieter assumption that had crept into the file, that private correspondence must mean secrecy with serious intent. People keep things off office ledgers for ordinary reasons too. Embarrassment, personal debt, family requests, a side arrangement over rent. Her review was useful precisely because it cooled the room. By the end of it, she had not destroyed the central theory, she had refined it. She concluded that the strongest case supported not a proved encounter between Beslane and de la Tour, but a likely planned county-side contact involving at least one intermediary, with de la Tour occupying the best documented county position among known persons. That sounds narrower because it is, and yet it is also stronger. It reduces imagination. It preserves what survives scrutiny. The unit accepted her revisions. Their working model changed again. Now they were not asking only whether de la Tour met Beslane, they were asking who arranged the meeting and whether de la Tour was the intended contact, the local facilitator, or simply the man everyone else expected would be there. That shift reopened interest in office intermediaries. Nella Orse returned to the edge of the inquiry, not as a target, but as a possible witness to office habits surrounding unofficial correspondence. So did the old Porter family. So did minor transport clerks whose names had once looked too dull to matter. One such clerk, Marcel Din, had been in the file only twice, both times as a signature on routing paperwork. He had died years earlier, but his daughter remembered that her father hated carrying messages not written cleanly, because verbal handoffs always went wrong. That is not evidence. Still, it suggested a working culture where unofficial messages were common enough to annoy someone. A county-side meeting could have traveled through that sort of irritation. It also reinforced something larger. Beslane's world was not split between neat office paper and rough county labor. The two were constantly touching through deliveries, repairs, route changes, and the small frictions of practical business. Years passed inside these comparisons, not wasted years, quiet years. A witness would die before one final clarification could be attempted. A box would arrive from regional storage and contain only duplicate forms. A granddaughter would produce a single postcard that changed nothing, except to confirm a spelling. You learn, in work like this, that progress often feels like reduction rather than accumulation. Fewer impossible theories, fewer false certainties, a more credible map. A smaller group of names. That narrowing finally became visible in the internal suspect matrix. At one point, 31 names had occupied the active board, then 19, then 11. By the time the unit completed its second full comparison cycle, only 4 remained central enough to justify continued deep review. De la Tour, Adrian Hale, the unidentified office intermediary implied by several records, and one final name that entered late and quietly, Benoit Leris. Leris had been easy to miss because he appeared in no witness statement from the first year. He emerged instead from county maintenance pay lists tied to gate oversight on branch roads. The lower gate, it turned out, was not always informally handled. At certain periods, it had designated oversight, contracted loosely through local labor rather than through full municipal staffing. And on one of the surviving quarterly sheets, the name B. Leris appeared beside branch access duties in the same season. That was enough to bring him in, not because gate oversight meant involvement in anything beyond ordinary work, but because the language of the notebook, gate not attended, now had a person attached to the possibility of attendance. Investigators looked for him in the usual old case way, first in directories, then in descendants, ancient files, and church records. They found a grandson who had inherited a shed full of paperwork when the family farm was sold. Inside was a tin of folded receipts and one rolled maintenance map. No confession, no missing proof. But the map had annotations in two hands. One hand, likely official, marked repairs. The other hand listed expected users for certain evenings. Most were practical: timber cart, fuel wagon, stock run. And on one line, hard to date precisely but within the right cluster of months, there was an entry that read town caller after meal. That phrase landed softly in the room because it was so close to what they already knew. Not identical. Close. County caller after supper on Beslane's page. Town caller after meal on the gate map. The words did not prove the same event, yet they suggested a shared habit of phrasing arrangements around meals rather than exact times. That is exactly the sort of human consistency that can support an old investigation. People often remember hours badly. They remember routine markers better. Before supper, after meal, at closing, by lamplight. Those are not vague if you understand the daily life they belong to. Leris's role remained uncertain. He may simply have annotated expected evening traffic. He may have had no idea who the town caller was. He may not even have written the note himself. But his records gave the unit something they had lacked: a practical mechanism. If Beslane expected a county-related meeting after supper, and if a gate attendant or branch overseer expected a town caller after meal, then the long abstract theory of arranged movement had found a functional bridge. Someone could have been told to expect someone else. Someone could have waited and not been met. Someone could have arrived and been redirected. This brought the unit to a new decision. They would stop searching for a singular dramatic event and instead reconstruct a chain of intended handoffs. Message from office. Relay through workshop or transport contact. County-side expectation at branch gate. Possible movement toward cottage or secondary track. This model was less elegant than the old image of one meeting between two men. It was also more faithful to the records. Real arrangements in working communities often move through several people, none of whom sees the whole shape. When the team applied that model, several old confusions softened. The station porter's uncertain memory of a man checking folded paper could fit someone confirming where to go next. The call office inquiry about county rates could fit someone trying to verify a change or delay. The garage attendant's memory of a question interrupted halfway through directions could fit a man who realized he had already been told enough. The absent gate attendant in the widow's notebook could fit a handoff that failed at one point, even if it succeeded later at another. The file was becoming clearer, not solved, clearer. And clearer files can sustain stronger late-stage leads. The strongest of those arrived through handwriting, though not in the dramatic way people often imagine. No one found a signed confession. No perfect match appeared on some forgotten document. Instead, the document examiner revisited a set of notations from 3 different sources: Beslane's desk calendar, the rear office chalkboard photograph, and the annotated gate map from the Leris shed. The purpose was modest: to test whether any one hand might have copied phrasing from another, or whether the similarities were only cultural habits. The examiner's report was cautious to the point of restraint. The chalkboard wording could not be attributed at all. The surviving image was too poor. The gate map annotations appeared to involve at least 2 writers, one likely Leris, one unknown. But the unknown hand, on the phrase town caller, after meal, showed one feature also present in Beslane's private note: a distinctive open top on the lowercase form of certain letters. and a spacing habit before location words. This was not enough for identification. It was enough to suggest that either the unknown writer had seen Beslane's wording, or both men wrote in a similar clerical style common to office hands of the district. Again, the case did not leap. It leaned. Still, the implication mattered. If Beslane's phrasing had migrated, then a message may have been copied or relayed into county records by another hand. The arranged contact was not merely spoken. Part of it had touched paper on more than one side. That was when investigators gave serious weight to a late-stage lead centered not on Delatour alone, but on a three-point relationship: Beslane, Delatour, and an office-linked intermediary who carried the arrangement outward. The leading candidate for that intermediary shifted over time. For a while, Adrian Hale held the place because of the workshop appointment book. Then the weight moved toward Marcel Dean's office circle because routing signatures clustered there. Later, it moved again toward an unnamed porter-level figure because rear lane use and informal notices seemed more likely to pass through that role. This uncertainty was frustrating in the ordinary, sleepy way old cases frustrate, not because there was nothing, because there was almost enough. The unit chose not to force a single intermediary too soon. Instead, they tested the strongest composite lead they had. Could Delatour be placed in active contact with a town office arrangement on the relevant evening by means of records that were independent of the family memories and independent of one another? To answer that, they assembled a corrobation pack: the workshop note, the county labor gap, the later river landing employment, the cottage rental, the lower gate geography, the branch road waiting notation, the office note about a county caller after supper, the weakened front desk receipt, and all associated road and timing models. Then they went looking for one more support. In a long investigation, that is often the question. Not, can we solve it all? Can we support this one lead enough to risk building around it? The support nearly came from a source no one had expected: a family Bible. A descendant of the Oars line contacted the unit after sorting property from an aunt's house. Inside the Bible were births, deaths, marriage names, and one folded scrap used as a marker. The scrap was not religious. It was a list of errands. Feed account. Needles. Take cream letter to M. Ask porter if county man came. That final line changed the rune, not because it named Beslane. It did not. Not because it named Delatour. It did not. But because it proved that someone in the office family orbit had, at some point, framed the matter exactly as the case now understood it. A cream letter, a porter, a county man expected. The scrap could not be dated precisely enough to stand alone in court. It had no full names. And M could have referred to many people. Still, it had the quality the unit had learned to respect. A note made for use, not for history. No one writes an errand line to impress a future investigator. They write it because they do not want to forget before supper, or before the shops close, or before the wrong person leaves for the evening. That made the scrap valuable, even in its limits. It supported the same quiet structure that had been emerging for years: a cream letter, a porter, a county man whose arrival or non-arrival mattered enough to check. The decision after that was careful. The unit would not announce a breakthrough. They would test whether the scrap could be anchored in family chronology. Whose handwriting was it? Which aunt kept it? When had the Bible entered that branch of the Orse family? What other papers were stored beside it, and from what years? These are slow questions. But slow questions often save a file from false hope. The family could account for the Bible itself only imperfectly. It had passed from one sister to another, then to an unmarried aunt, then to a niece who finally put it in a cupboard and forgot it. The scrap was folded twice, and the paper stock was ordinary household stock, not office issue. The ink had browned with age. The handwriting comparison was suggestive, but not decisive. The analyst thought it was likely from the hand of a woman accustomed to domestic lists rather than clerical entries. That pointed toward the Orse household, not the office books. Useful, but limited. Then came the quiet consequence. If someone in the Orr's family circle had been carrying or meant to carry a cream letter to M, and also meant to ask a porter whether a county man had come, then the line between private home life and office arrangement had narrowed again. It suggested that whatever was being coordinated was not sealed inside formal business. It moved through kitchens, family errands, and the kind of practical trust that lets one person hand a letter to another without ceremony. That did not tell the unit whether the arrangement was innocent, tense, financial, or personal. But it did tell them that the path between Beslane and the countryside might have involved more women, more relatives, and more ordinary domestic motion than the old file had ever noticed. So the investigation widened in a different direction. Not outward to roads this time, but inward to household patterns. The analysts began reconstructing who, in the office orbit, was likely to run errands after closing, who lived near the stationer that sold the cream envelopes, who passed by the porter's route on the way home, who had family reasons to travel between town and county without attracting notice. This was patient work. There were no grand discoveries at first. A sewing bill here, a rented room there, a cousin who worked in laundry and crossed the river twice a week. Most of it yielded only texture. But the texture mattered. It showed that messages could travel through the Beslane world with very little paper at all. A folded note, a remembered phrase, an errand tucked between flour and lamp oil. One of the most important setbacks came in this period. The stationer's successor was located at last, and with him a small trunk of inherited business remnants. Everyone hoped for a sales book, a customer list, a line showing who bought cream stationery that week. Instead, the trunk held wrappers, sample cards, and a bundle of unpaid invoices from a much later decade. There was almost nothing from the relevant years. One paper label showed that the cream stock had been sold in 2 grades. That was all. Even so, the unit logged it. In a file like this, even disappointment has to be named properly. It meant the paper comparisons could narrow quality, but not purchaser. At the same time, the late-stage lead around Delatour continued to hold. Though never completely, the river landing records placed him near enough. The workshop note suggested someone should ask Luke. The county cottage still sat where it had always sat on the map, practical and discreet. And yet one crucial element still refused to settle. No surviving record put Delatour and Beslane together in one documented place, at one documented time. That missing hinge shaped everything. Without it, the case could advance in understanding, but not close. The unit responded as careful units do. They stopped trying to prove a complete encounter directly. Instead, they looked for parallel proof. Could they show that Beslane moved toward the county arrangement, even if the final contact stayed just beyond the edge? Could they show that Delatour, or someone in his position, moved to receive that arrangement, even if Beslane himself vanished from the record before the last step? It was a quieter aim. But sometimes a quiet aim reaches further. One analyst took Beslane's side of that question. Another took Delatour's. They worked almost like 2 historians on adjacent desks, each assembling a life for a narrow band of days. On Beslane's side, the argument strengthened around routine break. No library entry, private stationery in use. The spare correspondence ledger requested the desk note about a county caller after supper, possibly related phrasing in the rear office area, and witness accounts that increasingly suggested checking, pausing, reconsidering. On Delatour's side, the pattern was different. Not orderly routine disrupted, but loose labor made briefly visible. The cottage, the gap in quarry work, the infirmary note, the later river labor, the workshop reference to Luke, and county geography that fit his known movements better than it fit anyone else still on the board. When the 2 patterns were placed side by side, the overlap was not perfect, but it was strong enough to keep drawing the unit back to the same narrow corridor of days. This is often where people outside investigations imagine a final piece will appear, a box in an attic, a confession in a will, a clear signature on a forgotten receipt. Sometimes that happens. More often, what appears is smaller. A date correction, a weather note, a road closure that makes one route impossible and another newly likely. The Beslane file received exactly that sort of small but meaningful development. A county engineering ledger, requested for an entirely separate review, noted that the upper turn near Westmoreland had temporary drainage work on the relevant evening hours, not a full closure. Just enough mud and obstruction to slow carts and force some traffic toward the lower gate branch. That mattered quietly, but a great deal. It made the lower gate not just one possible meeting point, but the practical one. Suddenly, the widow's notebook line about waiting at the branch gate gained more weight. The Leris map gained more weight, and the whole geometry of the evening narrowed. The consequence of that narrowing was immediate. The unit reran the timing models, not on the broad road network this time, but on the lower gate route specifically, from the supplier's rear lane, to the side street, to the north road, to the lower gate branch, on foot, by car, by wagon pace. The old contradiction between public sightings mattered less and less. A person leaving quietly by the rear could reach the branch within a window that still fit the after-supper language. A person waiting at the lower gate could remain there 20 minutes and still not appear in the public town routes where the earliest investigators had looked. This did not solve the central absence, but it made the reconstructed route more believable than it had ever been before. And yet the strongest late lead still nearly failed on the same old problem. It answered many questions at once. Why county references kept surfacing, why private stationery mattered, why the rear lane mattered, why Delatour remained difficult to dismiss, why the lower gate seemed functionally important. But when the unit asked the simple closing question, what exactly passed between Beslane and the county side, the records went thin again. No document gave the purpose, no letter survived, no witness remembered content. Only arrangement, only movement, only expectation. That distinction became central to the next years of work. A great many elegant explanations had to be resisted. Perhaps it was money, perhaps land access, perhaps some private obligation, perhaps a personal matter hidden from office ledgers. All were possible. None could be proved from the surviving file. So Vale wrote one of the more important internal notes in the case. He wrote that motive theories were to remain subordinate to documented mechanics. In other words, do not let a neat reason outrun the road, the paper, and the times. That note kept the file honest. From there, the case entered its most disciplined phase. Every promising lead had to be tested not by how satisfying it felt, but by whether it survived independent checks. When one theory suggested the cream letter to M meant Mireille, the family timing had to support it. When another suggested M might mean Marcel, the office records had to support it. When someone proposed that Ask Porter referred to the front desk porter, the rear lane notebook had to be considered too. The file became a place where almost every sentence had a companion sentence beside it, asking whether this really held. One by one, some of the more attractive ideas fell away. The notion that Beslane had planned to travel far beyond the county line weakened when later transport comparisons showed no practical onward route that matched his habits. The notion that the missing letter had been a formal business letter weakened when the cream stock and spare ledger pattern kept pointing toward private handling. The notion that the entire case hinged on mistaken identity weakened as object after object continued to tie the office, the county branch, and the private communication trail together. The file became less dramatic. It also became more precise. A late interview with the daughter of a municipal messenger added another small support. Her father, she said, used to complain that county people and town people never agreed on exact clocks. They agreed on meals, weather, and market close. She remembered him saying that if someone wrote after meal, it could mean a narrower window than an exact hour, because everyone in that circuit understood whose meal and which close of day was meant. This was not evidence of Beslane's own arrangement, but it was excellent context. It helped explain why the phrases after supper and after meal appeared so persistently meaningful, without becoming exact in a modern sense. It also reminded the unit that older cases are often solved less by extracting precision from the past than by learning what counted as precision to the people living there. Years of quiet comparison had now done what the early investigators could not have done. It had changed the Beslane case from a single unresolved evening into a documented system of partial coordination: town office, private note, possible family errand, workshop relay, county branch expectation, cottage adjacency. One person may not have seen the whole picture. The file, after decades, finally did. And once it did, another decision became unavoidable. The unit would assemble a full prosecutorial style brief, even though no charge was yet possible. Not for court. For clarity, for the next set of eyes, for the possibility that one final record, if it ever appeared, would need a stable frame waiting for it. That brief began with what they could document confidently: Armand Beslane's ordinary routines, their break in the relevant week, his use of personal cream stationery, his request for the spare correspondence ledger, the office note indicating a county caller after supper, the rear office photograph supporting similar wording, the weakness of the front desk timing once Thomas Hale separated receipt from identity, the county road naming overlap, the cottage connected to Luc de la Tour, the workshop note about an office man and Luc, the lower gate branch records, the waiting notation, the family scrap mentioning a cream letter and a county man, and the narrowing of likely routes due to the drainage conditions near the upper turn. This was the spine of the late-stage lead. Then the brief listed what was strong but not final. That de la Tour was probably the Luc in the workshop note. That the cream letter likely tied into the same chain of arrangement. That Beslane probably intended a county-side meeting after supper. That a porter or similar intermediary likely facilitated part of the handoff. That the lower gate branch, rather than the broad road generally, was the most probable transfer point, and that the original local theory had been incomplete because it ignored the rear lane, the county route, and the private communication pattern. Finally, the brief listed what remained unproved: the content of the missing letter, the identity of M, the exact role of de la Tour, the full identity of the intermediary, and the final documented point at which Beslane could be said, without inference, to have moved from office world into county arrangement. This act of listing mattered more than it might seem. In old investigations, clarity is a form of respect. It respects the dead, it respects the family, it respects the detectives who did earlier work with lesser tools, and it protects the file from becoming folklore. The Beslane case had flirted with folklore more than once. A lonely cottage, a missing letter, road names spoken differently by different people, a man who checked folded paper before speaking. Those details can easily drift into story. The brief pulled them back toward evidence. Once the brief circulated, the legal side reviewed it with its own slow caution. They agreed that the late-stage lead around de la Tour and the county branch was substantial. They also agreed that it did not yet cross the threshold needed for accusation. One missing proof still stood in the way. Some direct tie between Beslane and the final county handoff, or some direct tie between de la Tour and the arranged contact, had to be found. Without that, the case remained a strong theory resting on many supports, but not yet a settled conclusion. This may sound frustrating. To investigators, it was also clarifying. It told them exactly what kind of thing they still needed. So the search changed shape again. Not broad now, targeted. They were no longer looking for everything. They were looking for one of a few specific classes of proof: a surviving message, a ledger notation, a transport or gate record naming the town caller, a family paper placing Luc and Beslane in the same practical chain, or an overlooked office note explaining who handled after-hours county contacts through the rear. That sort of narrowing can be strangely calming in a long case. For years the file had spread outward, now it drew inward. The number of unknowns had not vanished. but they had names. They had shapes. You could put your finger on the exact blank spaces. One of those blanks nearly filled through the old Porter family. A grandson sorting a trunk after a house sale found a stack of folded employment envelopes. Most were empty. One still held a payslip and a short note on scrap stock. The note, badly creased, referred to back entrance duty and the expected arrival of a caller from the county side. No date was visible at first, no signature either. The paper had been torn away from a larger sheet. Still, it looked very promising. Almost too promising. So the unit slowed down as they had learned to do. Paper analysis dated the stock broadly but not narrowly enough. The handwriting comparison suggested an office supervisory hand, but not a unique one. A pressure mark on the back hinted that the missing upper portion may have contained a weekday reference. Under angled light, the most readable surviving words were "prepare rear, county caller," and "if delayed." Those phrases aligned powerfully with the Beslane theory. But alignment is not identity. The family could not say from which year the envelope set came. The porter in question had worked several periods, some before Beslane, some after, so the note did not become the final bridge. It became something almost as useful, proof that after hours rear entrance handling for county callers was a real office practice, not just a reconstructed possibility. That mattered deeply. It supported the whole mechanism of the case even while failing to close it. Another near miss arrived from a shipping insurer's archive. The supplier had, at times, filed small claims for delayed county goods. Most records were routine and unrelated. Then one claim mentioned a missed branch transfer and a confusion over whether the receiving party had gone to the lower gate or remained at the office. The wording was dry, almost stubbornly so, and that dryness is often what makes an old record trustworthy. It did not try to explain why the transfer had been missed. It only preserved that two expected locations had briefly competed with each other. That mattered because it matched the whole late theory without sounding shaped by it. If a receiving party could be expected either at the office or at the lower gate, then the arrangement was more flexible and more vulnerable to failure than investigators had first imagined. A chain with more than one handoff can break quietly. A person waits in one place while another waits elsewhere. A note is copied but not carried. A porter assumes the caller has already gone out the back. A county man assumes the office man is still inside. And in a case like Beslane, that kind of ordinary confusion may be more important than any dramatic hidden act. The insurer's claim did not name Armand Beslane. It did not name Luc Delatour either. Still, it placed the supplier's business culture inside a very specific pattern. Office or lower gate. Town side or branch side. A practical uncertainty built into the route itself. That changed how the unit read the old witness accounts. Before, they had been trying to settle where Beslane was. Now they also had to ask where he was expected to be. Those are not always the same thing. A witness can see a man in one place. A note can direct another man to a different one. And the case file, if it is patient enough, learns to hold both truths at once. So they rebuilt the evening again, but this time around expectation rather than location. Who expected a county caller? Who expected the lower gate to be attended? Who expected the rear entrance to be used? And who, perhaps, expected a cream letter to smooth the uncertainty before anyone had to travel at all? The result was not simpler, but it was more human. No longer one fixed appointment, a chain of understood habits, with room for delay, substitution, and small mistakes. That approach also did something else. It reduced the temptation to treat every surviving phrase as a code. The Beslane file had gathered enough suggestive language over the years that people could begin hearing hidden meanings where none were required. County caller, town caller, after supper, after meal, lower gate, rear entrance. In truth, these may have been plain working terms. Plain terms can still carry a mystery. They do not need to be secret to matter. Vale wrote that down in one margin note. Do not romanticize the practical. It is a brief sentence, but it may be one of the wisest in the whole file, because once investigators stopped imagining a hidden world and focused instead on an ordinary world, arranged a little privately, the remaining evidence aligned more cleanly. The legal review that followed was narrower than the earlier one. This time the question was not whether the county lead deserved continued work. That had already been answered. The question was whether the structure now justified naming any person publicly in relation to the case. The answer remained no, not because the lead was weak, because it was close. And close is exactly where care matters most. A late-stage theory can become very persuasive inside a file. That does not make it ready for the world. So the unit kept the names inside working papers. Delatour remained the principal county figure. Leris remained the most plausible gate-related figure. Adrian Hale remained an intermediary candidate through the workshop note. And the unidentified office hand, whether porter, clerk, or family runner, remained the softest but perhaps most essential shape in the whole case. Without that office hand, the chain became too tidy. With that office hand, the Beslane world finally looked like itself again. Paper passing through several ordinary lives. The family was updated in careful stages. By then, Mireille was no longer alive. The briefings went instead to her nephew and to a niece who had taken over keeping the older letters and duplicate family notes. They listened the way families in long cases often do, with a kind of trained calm. They had heard too many partial turns over the decades to mistake movement for ending. Even so, one detail affected them more than the larger theory. It was the repeated return of the cream stationery. That seemed to make Armand present in a more intimate way than roads and labor ledgers could. A paper he chose, a habit he kept, a private line of communication that the case had almost lost. The niece brought out Mireille's preserved letter again. It had already been studied more than once. Still, people looked at it differently now, not just as the last family letter, as the surviving member of a pair. One cream letter still in hand, one cream letter gone. That pairing gave the whole inquiry a quiet center. Around it, all the roads and ledgers seemed to turn. A new document examiner was asked to review the family letter one final time, not for dramatic authorship questions, for sequencing. Was there any sign Beslane wrote it in haste? Was it drafted before or after the sort of pressure mark seen on the desk note? Could fold habits suggest whether he was already carrying other papers that evening? It may sound excessive. It was not. At that stage, the difference between a calm domestic letter and one written while juggling another arrangement could matter. The examiner found no miracle in it. Only a little more texture. The letter to Mireille had been folded with unusual care. The crease lines were sharper than those on most personal correspondence from the same period. The page edges showed a brief pause before final insertion into the envelope, as though it had been read over once before sealing. Again, not mystery by itself, but consistent with the broader portrait. Beslane checked things. He reread, he confirmed before sending. The family, hearing that, said it sounded exactly like him. There was another consequence too. If Beslane treated even family correspondence with that level of care, then the missing local letter was unlikely to have been careless. It was probably written deliberately, addressed deliberately, and intended to reach someone specific enough to justify private handling. That sharpened the stakes around the missing recipient. Whoever should have received that letter may still be the most important absent person in the file. So the unit returned once more to recipient possibilities. They built a list only of names and initials beginning with M, tied to Beslane's office orbit, county orbit, or family orbit. It was a shorter list than earlier rounds had produced. Some names fell away instantly. Too young. Gone from the district too early. No route to county roads. No link to cream letter handling. Others remained. Marcel Din, a widow named Maud Perrin, who occasionally took in copying work. A mechanic called Maurice Lorne, who serviced road gates for a period. And, faintly at the edge, Mireille herself, though most investigators thought the family letter in hand already occupied that place. Still, they did not assume. Assumption had cost this file too much already. Maud Perrin opened one small path. She had been nearly invisible in the records, appearing only in local account books as a paid copyist during periods of office backlog. When the analysts traced her household, they found that one of her sons had later worked seasonal repairs near the lower gate branch. That overlap was enough to justify a deeper review. No one expected her to become central, yet old cases often depend on people who seemed too peripheral to notice the first time. Perrin's surviving papers were sparse. A church contribution book, 2 recipe cards, a stack of copied verses, and one account slip showing she had been paid by the supplier's office in the same month Beslane requested the spare correspondence ledger. That was not proof of anything beyond work. Still, it introduced another possibility. If extra copying was being handled quietly through outside hands, then the missing letter or related notes may have passed beyond the office itself. The chain may have been even less formal than previously thought. The analysts did not rush that line. They compared all known supplier payments to copyists over a 2-year band, most clustered around tax periods and inventory reconciliations. The payment to Maud Perrin did not stand out in amount. It stood out in timing. It came just when Beslane's own office trail was becoming unusually private. Enough to note, not enough to elevate. The file learned by this stage to live with that distinction. Meanwhile, the county side offered one more careful gain. A box of road permits, long thought destroyed, surfaced in a provincial storage annex during a cataloguing project. Most of the permits were irrelevant. Farm movement, hay loads, bridge repairs. Then one temporary access slip referred to evening passage authorized for supplier-related goods near the Morin branch, within the same week that all the old phrases clustered. No names again. But the issuing notation included an abbreviated office mark matching the supplier. That mattered because it gave the county branch arrangement administrative weight, not merely talk now. There had been enough practical business that week for evening branch access to be recognized on paper. This had a subtle but important consequence. It made innocent explanation stronger in one sense and more complicated in another. A county meeting connected to Beslane did not need to be secretive in purpose. It could have been entirely routine in subject. Goods, access, road use. What remained private may have been not the purpose itself, but the method of arranging it. That distinction cooled several speculative theories inside the unit. Perhaps the case did not hinge on hidden motive at all. Perhaps it hinged on a routine matter handled through an unusually fragile chain of people and places. That possibility carried a kind of sadness, not because it was grand, because it was small. A life can disappear into an old file not only through extraordinary plans, but through ordinary arrangements that fail at just the wrong point. A delayed message, a shifted route, a person expected at the office who goes instead to the gate. A person expected at the gate who remains by the rear entrance a little too long. When investigators began speaking quietly in those terms, the Beslane case seemed both clearer and more elusive. The prosecutors reviewing the latest summary agreed with one major recommendation. The case should now be treated as one in which the principal unanswered question was not broad identity, but sequence. What happened first in the chain? Who carried the message outward? Who confirmed the branch location? Who failed to meet whom? And at what point did the ordinary arrangement become the unresolved absence the file had inherited? That was a very useful reframing. It gave the next years of work a steadier purpose. So, the unit began trimming the file for sequence only. Every record was marked by whether it spoke to preparation, relay, travel, waiting, or aftermath. Preparation included the cream stationery, the spare ledger, the family letter, and the county caller note. Relay included the workshop book, the possible porter notes, and the Orse family scrap. Travel included the station witness, the call office memory, the garage attendant, and the permit for evening branch access. Waiting included the widow's notebook line, the lower gate map annotations, and the insurer's missed transfer language. Aftermath included little more than silence, revised assumptions, and the long shelf life of a file no one could close honestly. When arranged that way, the case became almost austere. You could see exactly where the evidence gathered and where it vanished. Preparation was strong, relay was plausible, travel was suggestive, waiting was more strongly documented than anyone once realized. Aftermath was nearly empty. And that emptiness, more than anything else, defined the mystery. One analyst remarked, in a note never meant for public reading, that the file looked like a bridge with the final planks missing. That was an apt image, not because the rest was weak, because so much of the structure now held. You could cross most of it in your mind, then stop, with a small distance left, unable to step further without pretending. That refusal to pretend kept the case alive in a disciplined way. The unit did not announce likely answers as settled fact. They kept testing. They revisited one of the oldest assumptions of all, that Beslane himself had authored every key phrase tied to the arrangement. What if some wording had been copied by others, and the plan evolved around him rather than from him? What if the county caller note reflected an expectation placed upon him, not one he initiated? That reopened the question of office power. Who, in practical terms, could ask Beslane to handle an after-supper county matter? Who could use his habits of order and privacy without drawing notice? The supplier's ownership structure was reviewed more deeply than before, not because owners were suspected in any dramatic sense, because authority shapes paperwork. A managing partner had died years earlier and left almost no personal archive. A junior supervisor, however, survived longer in municipal committees and left scattered correspondence behind. In those letters, investigators found repeated references to informal evening handling during busy periods. Nothing tied directly to Beslane, but enough to show that after-hours office tasks were normal under certain practical pressures. This made the rear lane activity less exceptional. And when something becomes less exceptional, investigators can place it more accurately. The junior supervisor's letters also carried one phrase that drew quiet attention. He referred to trusted hands, meaning people in the office who could be relied upon to manage awkward or off-sequence tasks without fuss. Beslane may have been one of those trusted hands. So might a porter. So might a copyist or family helper attached to the office orbit. The phrase did not identify anyone, but it helped the unit understand the culture in which the missing chain likely operated, not a secret conspiracy, a practical system of trusted hands. That understanding supported another late search. Rather than hunt only named suspects, they searched for all references to trusted handling, special errands, off-sequence copying, and evening branch business across supplier, county, and workshop records. The yield was uneven, mostly minor confirmations, an extra key issued, a messenger paid after hours, a branch receipt delayed until morning, no final answer. But by then, the file had become mature enough to value confirmation. Confirmation is how a theory stops being lonely. The strongest remaining contradiction involved not people, but time again. Not Celia Van's old hour this time. Mealtime. How late, in that district and season, did after supper or after meal practically mean? This sounds almost too ordinary to matter. It mattered a great deal. If after meal meant one narrow interval, some routes fit. If it meant a broader social period, others did. So the unit did something very characteristic of patient investigation. They studied domestic routine, household diaries from the region, agricultural almanacs, women's club schedules, even market return notes. They were not trying to become sociologists. They were trying to understand what a phrase meant in lived time. The result was modest but useful. In that place, in that period, after supper usually implied not the moment plates were cleared, but the settled hour after the main household task had ended. Not late night, not twilight either. A calm, workable window. This helped tighten all the route reconstructions by just enough to matter. Celia Van's corrected memory, tied to dishes and a radio program, now sat more comfortably beside the county-side phrasing. The old contradiction had truly changed its nature. No longer a broken timeline, a layered evening with overlapping routines, town households settling, office rear lane activity, branch access expected, one person perhaps already moving between them with folded paper in hand. The file, at this point, was thinner in error and thicker in patience. Boxes had been reduced, duplicate dead ends removed, maps redrawn, witness memories graded more honestly. What remained on the table was not the full answer. It was the best documented path anyone had yet built through the Beslane case, and because it had been built so carefully, it asked one final hard thing of the investigators: to decide whether the case was now chiefly about proving a person or proving a pattern. Vale believed it had become